office. That arrest led to protests in the city in which at least 15 people were killed. Somalia is coming back from decades of turmoil, and the decision to boot the senior UN envoy is likely to harm relations with foreign powers trying to help restore stability in that country.
All right, a lot of focus on the state of Somalia as a republic. This follows the January 2nd, 2019 move by the government to actually declare persona non grata the special representative of the UN Secretary General for Somalia, Nicholas Haysom, who was also the head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia. Now, we just want to take a clear perspective, a clear look on this particular move by the Somali government to actually expel this individual, this envoy, this diplomat from this particular country. And already in studio, Professor Peter Kagwanja, who is the founding president and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute and also a reform strategist and policy thinker on governance, security and African affairs. Thank you for making time, as well as Abdi Wahab Sheikh Abdi Samad, who is a Horn of Africa analyst from Southlink Consultants. Many thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Welcome to Bottomline Africa. Now, let's talk about the United Nations diplomacy. We know Somalia's situation is complex, and critics might argue that the expulsion of Nicholas Haysom reveals the failure of UN diplomacy, especially in interfering in the state's freedom and sovereignty. Perhaps starting with you, Professor, what's your take on this particular move?
I think it is interference. I think it's failed diplomacy, and that's how that was my argument in a Sunday article. I say so because we have a track record of a UN officer who has served with distinction, Michael Keating, before Haysom. And Michael Keating was very sensitive to issues. He was faced with the same situation of the ongoing tension between the federal states and the central government. It has been there for the last 4 or 5 years. It's not a new thing. And the Somali people are trying to solve it, and they're in constitutional negotiations on how to deal with it. Then you come in and basically start imposing so-called international standards in a country that is struggling to emerge from over 20 years of civil war. I think the problem here is 1, activism, 2, insensitivity, and 3, ignorance of regional diplomacy.
Well, very clearly said. Abdi Samad, what's your take on this? We know of the feud between federal governments and central government, as he's just mentioned. So Somalia is a different state to deal with in terms of emerging from the years of civil war. Tell us what you think.
I'm not far from Professor Bita. The guy, in the name of the sovereignty, the Somali government expelled this guy. He failed to balance his vision and the reality on the ground. There is a lot of conflict of interest within the Somali community and also international community as well. And it's not the first time the African state expelled such kind of things. It happened in Congo, DRC. They expelled what you call the European Commissioner from Congo just a month ago. Similar happened in Burundi. They expelled all the international staff, all the UN staff from Burundi. So the problem is, before you became an ambassador, especially envoy to Somalia, you must understand the history of the people. You must understand the value and the norms of the community. You must understand, as Professor Peter says, the sensitivity of the community as well. The guy, in fact, that's a failed mission. It's a what they call, to be honest with you, it's kind of what they call the guy completely failed his mission. And if they don't take an action against him, the large number of the Somali community saw it as countries under occupation. And I think the UN they have done the right thing to expel him. Otherwise, the Somali are keenly watching whether the UN they are going to expel this guy or not. If they fail to do so, the Somalis said they believe they are under occupation because the guy became a governor of Somalia. Somalia is no longer what they call a sovereign state. And this is a point of contention for Somalis. When in fact, the UN, they agreed, to replace the Haysom, the tension now has become a normal. People, they see Somalia as an independent state. They can, in fact, channel their own concerns through the right channel for the United Nations.
All right. Now, what I'm getting here is it's a very tough balance between diplomacy and activism. When we take a look at the history, the UN blamed the security forces for the deaths that were caused after the arrest of Mukhtar that caused 15 deaths and detention of a couple of Somali nationals as well. Now, let's bear in mind the moratorium that is in place of execution on arrested fighters. Now, how UN is coming out, according to what I translated it to, it's urging for a softer stance by the federal government towards Al-Shabaab militants. Is this the line that the UN should actually take?
I think the point you made is key. UN need to exercise diplomacy on behalf of the international community. It is not a normal mission. Remember, the UN has a bad history in Somalia. From 1991 to 1995 is a failure of UN diplomacy in Somalia that led to where Somalia is, in a sense. It is a failure of UN diplomacy in Rwanda that led to the genocide. And as Africans, we must be bold enough to state as such. It's a failure of the UN diplomacy in Burundi that is bringing this festering situation. Why? Because you follow the text of civil society organizations, human rights groups. That is their work. They're supposed to be activists. They are supposed to highlight those things. They are supposed to even be sensational about their things. But the UN cannot afford to be sensational. The UN cannot afford to be emotional. That's why we are talking about UN diplomacy. UN diplomacy is supposed to be seen as the most honest broker in conflict situations. It is supposed to be as magisterial as the Caesar's wife, above suspicion. This time, the UN is steeped in civil society politics. It is steeped in civil society activism, and therefore, rather than being a solution to the Somali problem, it's actually beginning to become a problem. By the time a government sits down with the kind of gentlemen I know who are in Mogadishu, some of them, we have worked with them, they are very level-headed at the top. Now, by the time these gentlemen decide that it is time to tell this guy to move from Somalia, it is a very painful decision to them. But it is a sacrifice they were ready to take. Why? Because there comes a time when you have to assert your sovereignty as a nation. Take, for example, in Kenya. Kenya asserted its sovereignty vis-a-vis the International Criminal Court, which indicted the president and the deputy